Hi, I'm Melinda Kucsera, and welcome back to Fantasy Lore and More. And today we're talking to Jeff McIntyre about his debut novel, The Garden Gnome. So let's find out what that's all about. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you, Melinda. Thanks for having me. This is
Sure.
a great opportunity. Okay, The Garden Gnome, Theory of Magic, Book 1. I like to describe it as being a contemporary fantasy with a streak of science fiction, a side of Arthurian myth, and a bit of mythology. It's got a little bit of everything.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
didn't
So it's like
actually
a kitchen sink.
Kind of. The original concept was kind of a contemporary fantasy sci-fi mashup, and it became a little less sci-fi and more contemporary fantasy as I was writing it. And then as it got further along, I started adding in other things that I really loved, like mythology and Arthurian legend. So it it turned out to be kind of a mix of all the things that I love.
Oh, wow. So did things change because of the characters? Or you were like, this is a cool
S
thing. Maybe I
well,
want to throw that in there.
it
I'm just curious, like
so
who
the
spurred
the
the change?
inception of the story came from just a story idea I had. I had read a lot of fantasy, but a lot of contemporary fantasy where the that magic itself is
Right.
not the point of the story. It's and the fact that the setting
Sorry about that. My desk decided to attack me.
um that the setting of being contemporary fantasy and that magic coming to a contemporary setting wasn't really the point of the story. It was sort of either an afterthought or the world building very rapidly goes into magic's been around for forever. It's just not everybody knows about it, and it never really discusses the ramifications of what, like, if you took our real world and magic suddenly appeared. So that was the
Right.
original impetus. And my first concept was that scientists discovered a magic particle, and that magic particle led to basically humanity having the ability to do magic. Well, as I got further along, it kind of morphed into, well, what if we had magic before and it just suddenly reappeared? And that led to questions like, okay, if magic, a couple of questions. If magic has been here before and it's not anymore, where has it been? And you go back and you go, well, when did it disappear? And then you start going into mythology and you go, well, we used to believe in magic. We used to think that magic was real. You go back and look at Greek and Roman, and they absolutely believed that the gods walked the earth and that they had real influence and that spells were real. There's accounts of Romans going to temple and paying for blessings and curses. They believed in magic. So it kind of morphed into well, if magic existed at one time, what does that mean about mythology?
Right.
And that became a kind of a pillar of this story. And the Garden Gnome is essentially, the entire book is just an inciting incident for the series, which is the return of magic, and that all of the books that I'm planning are going to talk about magic coming to our world. Is it really going to be all that great? What is it going to do? What are we going to have to deal with? What I hate to say it, but a lot of people were like, "Oh, magic would be so cool." Like, would it? Would it
Yeah.
really?
Yeah.
There might be some cool things that you could do with it, but there's also a lot of scary things that could come about if magic came back. So that was sort of the impetus of the series. And the Garden Gnome is basically the inciting incident of magic returning to the real world.
It sounds like that was not a good thing. Magic returning.
Well, in the Garden Gnome, there are two antagonists, and one of them thinks it's a good thing, and one of them doesn't. And it's up to
Oh
you to
boy.
decide whether or not which one was right.
Oh boy. All right. So which one are we meeting in the excerpts you're going to read us?
So the excerpt, it's a little spoilery, but it's not that spoilery. But I'm going to read the excerpt where the Garden Gnome is actually introduced. It's actually fairly far into the book. It's like chapter 29 out of 54. So over halfway through the book before you finally have some of the main POV characters introduced to the gnome for the first time. And the one thing about my book that people should know is that it's a multi POV. This is very much a plot driven story with intriguing characters, but because there's so many characters whose perspective I wanted to get on this, it
Mhm.
takes a while for it to build up. It's actually one of my biggest complaints from critics is that it starts very slow because there's 5 main POVs, and I have to introduce them and get you to care about them before we get to anything really interesting.
Who
So
are the well, like, let's go to the excerpt, and then I want to know who
sure.
the others are, because now I'm curious.
All right. So Daniel and Sophia walked into Tony's room. Tony looked up from the video game he was playing inquisitively. Daniel leaned up against the door frame while Sophia walked over and sat on the end of the bed. Sweetie, we want to talk to you about Bob and some of the things that have happened lately. Tony tensed a little. Don't be mad. He's just here to keep me safe. Daniel frowned. I know you think that, bud, but we're worried. It's our job to keep you safe, not his. We want you to understand something. Bob isn't real. Your imaginary friend can't keep you safe. Tony's eyes grew wide and then he started giggling. If anything, this made Sophia and Daniel even more worried. Tony saw that they weren't laughing with him and quickly settled down. With childlike seriousness, he looked at each of them. Mom, Dad, Bob isn't imaginary. He's a gnome, and he's in the backyard. Daniel shook his head slowly. Tony, we've talked about this. Garden gnomes are mythical creatures. People make ceramic statues of them and put them in their garden because they think they're cute, but they're not real. Tony sighed the exaggerated sigh of a 10-year-old. He's real, and I can prove it. He hopped out of bed and stormed past them, heading down the hall. Sophia stood up and gave her husband a worried look. Daniel shrugged. We better follow him. They slowly turned to follow in the wake of their son as he turned the corner to head downstairs. Tony's head popped around the corner near the baseboard with an exasperated look on his face. Come on, hurry up. The head popped back around the corner, and the soft rumble of Tony's feet running down the stairs carried back to them. Despite their son's urging, Daniel and Sophia slowly followed their son down to the kitchen. With worry apparent on their face as they saw their son standing in front of the backyard door, hands outstretched, beckoning them to stop. First, you have to promise not to be mad when Bob tracks dirt into the kitchen. Daniel frowned at his son. Bud, if you bring in one of Mrs. DeLuca's garden gnome statues, you'll make her mad and upset your mom. Tony stomped his foot in irritation. Can I prove to you that Bob is real or not? Sophia looked at Tony worriedly and sighed. If there's a mess, we'll clean it up together. What are you going to show us? Tony held up his hands again. Wait here. I'll be right back. Tony opened the door to the backyard and took 2 steps into the darkness. He waved at the motion sensor above the door and the yard was flooded with light. Sophia sat down at the kitchen counter. I think we'd better find a counselor for him. Daniel took a couple of steps towards the back door so he could keep an eye on Tony. I don't disagree. I just wish we could have handled this ourselves. Tony had walked over to the row of bushes that made a soft fence between the lawn and the side street. He appeared to be having a serious conversation with it. Imaginary friends are often caused by emotional stress. It feels like we've failed him on some level. Daniel had half turned to talk to Sophia, but movement at the corner of his eye caused him to turn his attention back to Tony. He saw his pajama-clad son marching imperiously across the yard, headed toward the back door. Walking timidly behind him was something impossible. He was very short, barely a foot tall. His face looked kindly and wise, with ruddy cheeks and a long white pointed beard that hung past his rounded belly. He wore a thick white woolen shirt, a red pointed hat with matching trousers, and suspenders with large black buttons. He had black boots that seemed cartoonishly large for a small frame. You almost couldn't tell what color they were because they were clad in copious amounts of rich dirt and small pebbles. It looked as if some black forest witch had breathed life into a typical ceramic garden gnome. Daniel would have asked him to remove his shoes, but the absurdity of what he was seeing had momentarily stunned him. Seeing Daniel's reaction, Sophia stood up to get a better look at what he was seeing. She let out a strangled shriek as Tony and the gnome entered the kitchen. Tony glared at his mother in annoyance. Mom, don't be rude. Bob, this is my mom, Sophia, and my dad, Daniel. Mom, Dad, meet Bob. That's it. I go more, but it gets a little spoilery after that. I don't know.
Okay.
Bob is his nickname. The next line introduces his full real name, and I don't want to spoil that for people.
Okay, no, since this was pretty far into the book, then yeah, I totally understand that. So, all right, so we've got Bob the garden gnome, we've got the boy, and so who are the other main characters?
So Daniel and Sophia are the parents of Tony. Tony is never a POV character. He's just a 10-year-old kid who's their son. They're pretty normal people. Daniel is a history professor at a local university in Chicago. Sophia is a project manager for a financial services company. Just your average late 30s couple that has a single son who's 10 years old. The other POVs are a close family friend of theirs who is a reporter for the Chicago Tribune. There is a POV of a FBI field agent who has been assigned to investigate, we'll call them, protesters who are protesting a new experiment that's going on at Fermilab. So this is contemporary fantasy set in our world. So I use real world places that are public. There's references to restaurants that are fudged a little bit because I don't want somebody getting mad at me. But Fermilab is mentioned, CERN is mentioned. And then there's Leo Schaefer is the reporter. Deb Kasdan is the FBI agent, and then we have Brian Cook. Brian Cook is a special case. He is part of a conspiracy theory, essentially, a paramilitary organization that knows more about what's going on than the general public does, and they use a lot of power and influence to keep the world from knowing that magic ever existed. And they know that magic is about to come back again, and they're going to try and stop it. Brian is a new recruit to this organization. There's not very many of them that are in the core of this organization that know the whole story, and he still doesn't know the whole story, but they're slowly feeding it to him to help him understand the ramifications of what they're trying to stop, and at the same time trying to gauge whether or not they can trust him with the truth, essentially. So he's arguably one of the antagonists, and he's a primary POV.
Okay, so he's one of them. Who's the
Yes.
other one? You said there's two antagonists.
So the other one is not I don't call them a primary POV, and you don't necessarily know that they're an antagonist until very late in the book. So I'm not really going to discuss them.
All right, that's fine. We can keep
But
that one under
the
wraps.
they are the flip side of the coin, in that Brian represents those who are afraid of magic returning, and this is someone who is actively trying to get it to come back.
I see. So we've got that clash between those who want the magic and those who don't, and then we have our regular people who are just kind of caught in the middle. And
This story is very much a story of bad things happening to good people, and not for any reason that's any fault of their own. They have no idea what's happening, and they're all following different threads until the truth starts becoming revealed to them, and they make decisions about how they're going to handle that. Some of them don't have a whole lot of time to react. Some of them, don't find out until the end, where things have really hit the fan, and there's, what the choices are bad and worse. One of the things, I don't remember where I heard this. It's been a while since I heard it, but it's something that has always stuck with me, is that no one is ever the villain of their own story. And that stuck with me through this whole writing process. I love a good, blacker than black bad guy as much as the next guy. I love The Lord of the Rings. Sauron is a blacker than black bad guy.
But in his own mind, he's not the bad guy.
Yeah.
He's trying to restore order. Just nobody wants his kind of order.
I think that Sauron really is sort of is for power's sake. He thinks he should rule everything, and that those who rule with the light are just in his way. He's pretty much a black on black.
I don't agree with that. Like, I did think that until I read the Silmarillion, and I don't think that anymore. He in his own mind, he's trying to restore order, but his idea of order is that he controls everything. Yeah, and he is just obsessed with that.
I'll absolutely agree with you. When he was still a Maiar and before Morgoth's defeat, he was absolutely somebody that you could understand where he was coming from, but he'd become so corrupt by the time the Third Age came around. He's more or less a black on black. But
but he doesn't see that, though. He still thinks that he is that uncorrupted state, and that everybody else is corrupt, and that it's his way is the right way. And
the stories that have always stuck with me the most are the ones where the villains have a point, whether or not you agree with them. Sometimes they're deluded, sometimes they're insane. There's all kinds of reasons why people make bad decisions, and sometimes you have to say, well, I don't know that I would have made any different decision than they did. And that's why I have in this story, there isn't a good answer here. I have two antagonists, and you could probably understand both of their points by the end of the book, and you can choose a side if you want. They both did bad things, but they both believe that they were doing it for the right reasons. And I'll just leave it up to you to decide. But I've always felt that the villains or antagonists that you can relate to make for much more engaging stories. I remember those stories. It's just some of my favorite books have complex villains, and some of my favorite series ended up where the bad guys won. or the quote-unquote antagonist had a plan, and their plan on the surface was awful, and some of the things that they did along the way were awful, and at the end of it all, they came out on top. And it didn't necessarily mean that the good guys lost. It just meant that the bad guy succeeded at what he was trying to do. And those were fantastic stories.
Just from that's like most of the Silmarillion is like Morgoth like succeeding, like, yeah. So yeah, I can see why you'd like that. And Sauron, and before the Lord of the Rings is set, Sauron pretty much is winning.
Yeah. Well, and
nobody really even knows that he's still around, so he's just winning by default. There's nobody challenging him.
One of the things I liked about Saruman too, because Saruman was a very complicated character, and he was basically he was obviously being corrupted by Sauron through the Palantir, but I
don't know. I feel like I've heard some other
Lord
of the Rings people talk about like that the corruption started a lot sooner than that, because there was the White Council meeting way before the Lord of the Rings, the first council meeting, when they were when there was a necromancer. I think it was I forget the name of the place, and he was like, oh no, it's not Sauron, it's so like some people posit that was evidence that he was already sliding towards. Yes. We don't know exactly when he got the Palantir.
We don't know how long he had the Palantir.
That's it, yeah.
Yeah.
So there's some speculation that was.
I've always felt that if
he had flipped, or some people see it as he was on the edge, and just keeping his options open. I've heard various arguments either way, but I do agree that he's a very complex character. Though by the end, he's a little more simple. You realize that he is like Sauron. He wants control. He wants to be the one on top. Yeah. He wants the ring for himself.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, his whole plan was to ally with Sauron up until the point where he could betray him and take the ring for himself, and then he would be the good guy, because he would use the power of the ring to defeat Sauron, and he'd be like, "Hey, look at me, I'm a good guy." Meanwhile, he's created this whole new race of evil orcs, more powerful than any orcs that have existed since the Second Age, and he's devastating the environment. He's waging war on Rohan, which is one of the last bastions of light.
Yep.
Like, yeah, you're the good guy, all right.
But he's so blinded by that, like by the ring and what it represented and what he thought he could do with it, never realizing that you wouldn't be able to get rid of it. Like that's the reason the ring persisted for thousands of years.
Yeah,
is that nobody could once you got it, that's it. You don't want anybody to know you have it, and you don't want to lose it, because remember, Gollum had it for hundreds of years, and he just hid it away because he didn't want to lose it. It was just precious.
But yeah, I mean, that's ultimately, I've always felt that the antagonist that you can relate to and understand what their argument is, even if you don't agree with it, is much more compelling, makes for a much more compelling story than the, I'm bad because I'm bad, or I just want power and I'm going to kill whoever gets in my way. There's certainly a place for characters like that, but I much prefer the, and I hate to say it, but the Thanos was right argument. I don't necessarily agree with it. Thanos was right, but I can agree with the sentiment that if he hadn't been absolutely insane, he did have a point. Just his solution was awful, and that's not. It wasn't even a solution. So.
Well, we can't go by the movies, because he didn't really he just sat around and let other people do things.
Yeah.
In the comic book, he was a little bit more active and engaged in things. Unless I'm misremembering them. It's been a long time since I read those.
I never actually read the Infinity War comics, except like a few outliers here and there. But
I had the graphic novel.
Oh, cool.
I found it in Barnes & Noble when I was a teenager, and I was like, this is interesting.
Nice. So yeah, the Garden Gnome, it came out of a lot of things that I love. There's a lot.
So you love garden gnomes? Do you have a collection?
Honestly, so
I've been dying to ask that. I was, because you said you got the idea from, where you had the idea. I was like, do you have a collection of garden gnomes that you're hiding?
I have now. I have a couple.
Okay, so that came about after you wrote the book.
I was never particularly a fan of garden gnomes. I didn't actually own any. And I was trying to think of a small magical creature that would be interacting with Tony, that would seem, at least on the surface, to be not dangerous, that people might trust. And I came across garden gnomes, and I'm like, well, they're cute. And then I did some research on garden gnomes and found out where they originally came from. And let's just put it this way: we really cutified them. The only thing that modern garden gnomes have to do with the original is that they're short.
So let's get into it. The original Garden Gnomes versus your Garden Gnome. Like, so what was the original, and what spin do you put on it?
So the gnome, the first written record of the term gnome was done by a 15th century alchemist / physician named Paracelsus. Paracelsus was a very eccentric and talented doctor who actually created some of the basis of what modern medicine, as far as like diagnostics and how we treat sickness and injury, still used today. So he was a genius, and a lot of people at the time thought he was insane. And one of the last things that he did was he wrote a book about spirits of nature that he believed were important to health and well-being, that humans needed to be more in tune with the natural world. And he claimed to have met spirits of earth, air, fire, and water. And he named them gnomes, salamanders, gotta remember these off the top of my head because I haven't done much with the others, sylphs, and yeah, it's going to kill me that I can't remember the last one. And he describes them in moderate detail. There's not actually that much detail other than the gnomes are no more than 2 hands high, which is about a foot, and that they're spirits of earth. They're essentially little earth elementals. And there's nothing about them that says they look humanoid other than that they have arms and legs. He doesn't describe them as looking like little humans, but over time, people have taken the concept of the gnome and turned it into the little ceramic statues that we have with, German pointy hats and boots. But mine looks like that for a while, and there's various reasons why he looks like a normal gnome, and it has more to do with us than it has to do with him. But his true colors are revealed eventually. I just was very fascinated with how over time we really warped that concept. The other creatures, the other elementals that he described are actually very old. They go back to Greek mythology. Salamanders are mentioned in the the Olympian mythos. Same thing with sylphs. And there's, researchers theorize that his concept for gnomes actually came from pygmies, which was also a Greek mythology thing. Pygmies were they were only about 3 or 4 inches tall, and they were the mortal enemies of storks. It's actually kind of a funny, almost children's story like thing that's in Greek mythology. They're not very mentioned very often, and they don't know how prevalent the story of pygmies were, but that they don't know for sure that that's why, since all the others came from Greek myths, they just kind of assumed, well, maybe he was talking about pygmies and he just renamed them because he didn't like the name pygmy. But gnome kind of originates from the Greek nomai, which is earth dweller. But yeah, I kind of fell in love with them after finding out that they're a little more complex than a ceramic statue, and so I baked some of that into the story. And the warping of history also made its way into some of the other mythology that I've got in the book. It actually goes back to what I was telling you earlier, before we started, about Megan's Etherbound, her Ether series, and what she was talking about to you about, the myths, her warping myths to her own purpose. And I did very much the same thing. Mine is, I'm trying to decide if I want to talk about this because it's kind of spoilery, but it's kind of not, and it's a interesting pillar of the whole series, but it is not a central pillar. It's an offshoot of the whole concept of the book, which is magic coming to our world, and like, what does that actually mean? So if magic comes to our world, you're going to have, you'd think in the past, if magic was here before, what does that say about our myths? What does that say about all of the famous and infamous magical things that are in our folk tales, and more importantly, our mythology? I've talked about Arthurian legend being a piece of this. When I say to you, what is the last great wizard you can think of that comes from our history? It's Merlin. So then in actual history, there's not a whole lot of support for Merlin. He came out of the stories, but there is a lot of history that supports Arthur as a concept, that he probably existed, whether or not his name was actually Arthur, but there was a king that united a large portion of Britain after the Romans left. The power vacuum that was created by the Romans evacuating Britain, a new king arises, he conquers everybody else, and medieval stories just wrote the crap out of that. But
well, I mean, he did kind of defeat the Romans, so I mean, you would.
Well,
I
defeat the
mean,
Romans, or the Romans just got tired of all the Celts. I mean, it's
we'll never know for certain
we'll
because
never
all
know
we
for
have
certain.
are Roman records at,
Yes.
because a lot of that survives. We don't have a lot from the other side, except myths
So
and stories. So
it,
we'll never know the truth of
yeah,
that.
but if we accept that Arthur probably existed, he would have existed in about the 5th century. So that's way before medieval times. That's barely, that's Iron Age. That's not
Mhm.
even really steel. So there's still a lot of bronze weapons. Steel is just starting to get invented. The Romans had access to it, but they weren't necessarily letting everybody else get access to it. So if prior to that, and keep in mind that this is also at the same time where Christianity is rising and paganism is being pushed down. Christianity puts a tamper down on magic. There is no magic. There are miracles. That's not magic. Paganism, which believed in magic, and all of the polytheistic, mythologies that are out there, the pantheons, none of that matters anymore. You should just ignore all of these stories you have about Zeus coming down and hurling lightning bolts at people because he was mad. That never happened. So the last real magic user anybody really talks about is Merlin. And this is just my world, okay? So if magic disappeared when Merlin did, why is that? So I kind of baked that into the story. And then all of those mythologies that got suppressed by Christianity, well, what if they were real? What if the gods really did exist? I mean, it's one of those things where you kind of go, well, ancient people were superstitious, but they weren't necessarily naive. And when they talk, especially like in Norse mythology, where they talk about, yeah, Odin came down and had dinner with us. You didn't look like Odin, but then after we ticked him off, he revealed himself, and yeah, Odin was here, and he punished us because we're being jerks to him. The You go, well, what if that actually happened? So then I started messing around with and doing research on the various mythologies that are all over Europe and Asia and Africa, and I found a couple of things where people talk about um, Indo-European mythology, which is that the mythologies of the Fertile Crescent, Babylon, Sumeria, all of those stories and those gods got dispersed all over Europe and Asia. When those cultures started traveling around and settling in different places, they changed the names of their gods, they morphed the stories, but the core of those stories still existed. So I have this premise of the kin, and the kin are worshipped as gods, but they're not. They're just really powerful magical creatures, which, if you're living in the Bronze Age or the late Stone Age, somebody with really powerful magic that can't die, that's a god. But by their own admission, gods have control over the underworld. They like to be worshipped as gods, but they don't have any control over the underworld. They don't have any special access to grant you to go to heaven or your equivalent of it. So the kin are basically a bunch of con men that have scattered around and spread myths about themselves so that people would honor and revere them, not for any personal sense of power other than their own ego. And that's something that is very briefly touched on in the Garden Gnome. And it's, like I said, I don't know if I'll ever write a story. I might write some short stories about what the kin were doing and how it fits into the world at large, but they're never intended to be the point of the story, because it's just sort of a side effect of, well, if magic existed in the distant past, that probably means that the gods were real in some fashion. And the kin is my answer to that.
Are the kin still around in the modern day when the magic comes back?
Oh, yes, they are. That's the Yeah, they are. I'll just leave it at that.
Is that something that we see in book 1, or is that something we can look
A little
forward to
bit.
in future books?
A little bit. There's one of the kin, arguably two of the kin are in the first book, and there will be at least one, probably two more introduced in the second book, as I've got it outlined so far. But yeah, I mean, it's been a lot of fun, kind of, I'll call it an advantage and a disadvantage. But when you write a contemporary fantasy that's set in our world and then take off from there, I get to play around with our history and our mythology. The downside of that is I don't have elaborate world building that I can do, other than with things like the kin, which is kind of a spin on our own mythology to make it all kind of make sense. But everything that happened in our world has happened in the world of the Garden Gnome. I mean, I make reference to a nuclear test that happened in the 80s, an actual nuclear test, and the impact that it had on this story. So there's just been a lot of fun, and I look forward to writing more about, well, let's say the ramifications of magic in the real world.
How many books are going to be in the series?
So right now it's a little open-ended, but I have just kind of blurbs for about 4 or 5 more, just concepts. I mean, I've got the second one completely outlined, and I'm about 13 or 14,000 words into writing it. My writing on it has slowed down quite a bit over the last few months, but I'm hoping to get back rolling again. I have a kind of a personal goal to have the first draft done by the end of the year. That's going to be tough to do, but I'm still going to try. And then after that, I've got 3, possibly 4 other books that are basically just a rough concept. One of them I'm a little worried that there's not enough story there.
You've got time to work that out. You haven't even finished the second book.
Yeah, it's like I was just sort of brainstorming ideas of where I can go with these stories, and there's sort of a natural progression of the one sentence plot for each book, and it all makes sense. One of them, I'm a little worried that there's not enough story there, and it may end up getting merged into one of the other ones, but I will cross that bridge when I get done with book 3, I think, because book 3 still has a pretty linear progression of what's happening.
Are your characters, do they behave and follow your outlines, or are they unruly and do their own thing? Because if they're unruly, then don't worry about it. They'll come up with plenty of things for you to do in the book that you don't have as much for. Like, it's a blank page waiting for them to fill it, and they will do that if they're unruly.
Yeah, so I'm one of those. I'm a plantser. My
Yep, me
outline
too.
is like a paragraph per chapter, and the only reason why I do that is it gives me a couple advantages. I start off with an aim of 50 chapters, just to it worked really well for the first one, which ended up being 54. I think I'm at my current outline has 56 for book 2, and it just allows me to take a look at pacing. So I start off by just throwing a bunch of ideas for vignettes. This is a scene that has to happen, and I have really good ideas at the beginning. I have really good ideas in the end. I need, some highs and lows, and I need to figure out how this is all going to fit together. So I feel better when I have at least a sentence that says, okay, in this chapter, this happens. And the reason why this happens in my mind, it's a path for that character to get from A to Z. And once I have basically what I think is a natural flow of 1 to 2 sentence chapter highlights, then I go, okay, that's good enough, and I start writing.
But
And it
do the
gives me
characters do what you say
yes,
in those?
yeah. Every once in a while they surprise me, and I have to rejigger. But I'm not a slave to the outline either, because what happens is, um, I'll go through, and sometimes I'll get uninspired about writing sequentially. Be like, I don't want to write the next chapter, or I'll like write half of the chapter and get to a really complex section of dialogue, and I'm just not feeling it. I'm like, I'll figure this out later, and I'll be like, well, I want to keep writing, so I'll go to the outline. I'm like, I know this chapter has to happen, so I'll pluck that chapter out and I'll bang it out, and then maybe I'll feel a little bit better about going back and finishing the other one, or I may go write 3 in a row.
I
But
usually
the
just
outline
hand
at
the
least,
characters the wheel.
yeah,
Like, you know what? I don't want to write this.
yeah.
What do you think we should do here?
I actually had a chapter that was bothering me because it was going to have really confrontational dialogue that needed to be tight. It needed to show the tension between 2 people. And I stalled on it, and I stalled on it, and I stalled on it. And eventually I got to the point where, like, you know what? Maybe I need to rethink how I do this. And I came up with a completely different way of doing that scene, and I felt so much better. And I banged that chapter out in like a single evening. And I was like, oh, Thank God.
Yeah,
Because
that's
then it allowed
usually.
me. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
just sometimes you just got to go. I don't know if I can do this in any reasonable amount of time, and maybe I'll get inspired to do this later. But if I have a better, smarter, or just a way that feels easier for me,
Mm-hmm.
but the simple outline allows me to just kind of like bounce around if I want to, and sometimes that makes me have to readjust the outline. But usually I don't touch the outline until I'm actually almost done, and just making sure that all the chapters now go in a proper sequence. And that's all I use the outline for. And then after I'm done, I modify the outline so that it matches the book.
How far did book one drift from the outline? Was there a
So
big difference, or I'm just
it
curious.
originally had, I think when it was all said and done, it's 54 chapters plus a prologue and an epilogue. And before the prologue and epilogue, I was actually up to like 60 chapters. And what ended up happening is I didn't actually end up deleting any of it except for half of one chapter. I decided it was unnecessary. The others, I had chapters that, and maybe it was just convenient or serendipity, but there were chapters that were short that I was able to combine things that were essentially happening simultaneously that I didn't feel like I needed to have in a single chapter. I I'm one of those, dumb authors who head hops. I give you a warning. I have a little symbol in my book and a break every time I go from one POV to another, but it happens pretty frequently where I'll start from a POV of somebody, these events are going on, and then I will flip to a different scene in the same chapter, and you'll see what's happening simultaneously from somebody else's perspective, somewhere completely different.
That's not dumb. That's pretty common among authors.
Yeah, it's more common than it used to be.
Yeah. I
Um, I,
mean, I try to do it at the chapter because that's a natural break. But
yeah,
sometimes you just have to because the characters don't give you a choice.
the uh, the other thing that happened with my book is I lost about 15,000 words in editing, which was interesting. I was expecting it to get larger, and it did not.
Oh no, editing
Yeah,
always makes the
yeah.
book smaller unless it's underwritten, which is rare.
Well, and there was a part of me that I originally had a goal to hit 100,000 words for this book, and ended up going to about 105. And so when I edited it back down to 90, I was like, I feel kind of bad about this. I really wanted to have 100,000 words as a nice round, but I went through it. I'm like, I don't want to add anything because it would just be fluff. It
Yeah.
would be deliberately reinflating the story just for the sake of that. And so I was like, all right, 90,000 words it is. But yeah,
No, and that's a good length. I mean, traditionally published books are 90,000 to 120,000 words.
yes,
I haven't heard that that's changed. In the indie
no,
world, books are, can
they
be
can be
much
as big as they
shorter
want.
or
But
much longer. Yeah, like
well, and I originally had the idea that I might try and pitch this to agents, and eventually decided not to. So I was aiming for 100,000 words, basically because they say that's what your debut novel should be. But
I don't
ultimately,
know
I was
about
just
for contemporary. I feel like for contemporary they skew more towards the 90,000 than the 100,000.
yeah, it's
Like epic fantasy, like
getting
yeah.
over 100,000 is okay, but not much more than over 100,000. Yeah, it depends a little bit on the subgenre, but yeah, I was pretty happy with where it ended up at, and ended up going self-published anyway, just because I wanted to see it published in my lifetime.
Yeah, traditionally published books can take a long time, and
Yeah,
also the agenting process. Yeah, that can be rough. No shame to anybody who's pursuing that path. I
yeah.
chose indie publishing as well.
So I'm working on book two. I'm also working on a short story as a reader magnet for my newsletter. I haven't kicked off my newsletter, and I won't until that short story is done. But it's about a third of the way there, and I'm probably, I've got a fifth of a book or a sixth of a book for book two, and um, I've got 3, 4, and 5 kind of roughly laid out about what I want to do with them. But I also have an idea for a duology that when I get around to writing it, which I told myself I'm not going to touch it until after I've written at least through book 3 of this series, I may pitch that to agents. I think it's a really strong concept and would be a lot easier to market. And I'm kind of curious to see what the traditional pub route actually looks like. I can always fall back on this isn't working out, and I'll just self-pub it again. But
Yeah. No, that's a good idea. And there's many people who pursue sort of a blended path where they indie publish some things and traditionally publish others. I I'm just all indie. I like hitting the publish button. You don't get to do that when you're traditionally published.
That is true. There actually, the first
It's fun
time I
hitting that button because then you're like, okay, within the next 24 to 72 hours, my baby will be out there for people to read.
the
Which is
publish button
exciting.
was cool, but holding it in my hand,
Yes.
that was the best.
But you have to
The
hit the publish button
best.
before you can hold it.
Yes, you do.
And then you have to wait because, it has to be printed, it has to be shipped to you, and author
Yeah.
copies tend to take a couple of weeks where you're
Oh,
just waiting and checking the shipping thing. Like, is it here yet? Is it here yet? Where is it? Why is it not here?
yeah. So I plan on eventually. Right now, I'm just on Amazon. I'm working through draft to digital just because at some point I want wide distribution, but
Then you
it's
get to
not.
hit multiple publish
Yeah,
buttons. Like
yeah.
I distribute my books to multiple stores. Use draft to digital as well, but I also go direct to many stores, so I get to hit the button about like 5 or 6 times.
I'll bet.
It never gets old. It's always fun. It doesn't matter how many times you hit publish for a book. It's still wonderful. It's a wonderful feeling.
Just doing it on Amazon though, I did the ebook, which was smooth. I mean, it was painless. It's amazing how easy it is to publish an ebook. Paperback went relatively easily, although there were a couple of mistakes that were all on me, and I'm like, holy crap, this is not going to work. So I had to make some modifications to the like font size and just getting the formatting right so it looked right. So I had to get a couple of proofs of the paperback. The hardcover was the one, and there's no reason for me to do a hardcover. The Amazon's hardcovers are not very good. I discovered that after the fact.
Yeah, but if you want pretty hardcovers, Book Vault. They're very pretty. Yeah, you actually get the dust jacket. Yeah, Ingram also does the dust jackets, but the colors really pop on the Book Vault one. And Ingram, when they tend to be much duller. I don't know why that is, or if that's just the printer that sends the books to me. Maybe they have more than one printer. I don't know. So definitely no shade on them. But the Book Vault ones are much prettier. I have 4 of them at the moment.
Amazon says that their hardcovers are in beta, which
they have been for a while, like a couple of years now.
A couple of years now, and I mean, honestly, they don't look bad for having the printing on the outer cover that way. They look very similar to their paperbacks, just in a hardcover. The problem is
the colors are a little bit different, though. I do notice the paperback, the color is a little there's more variance on the hardcover that I've noticed.
For mine, it didn't really seem like there was any difference. The problem I had was
you got lucky. You're in that green band where because and not to get too technical, but there's RGB, which is your screen, which so when you're making and you're proofing the art for it, you're looking at it in one color space called RGB, but when you're printing, they're in CMYK, and CMYK is much smaller, and it's the bright, vibrant colors, except for cyan, because cyan is very bright, very vibrant, and that is very much a part of the CMYK spectrum. But the greens and the reds tend to get chopped off. There's a much narrower band, but you're in the muddier greens, which the CMYK is pretty faithful. Like there's a good correlation between the RGB equivalents and the CMYK ones. So what you saw on screen and what you held in your hand probably didn't have much variance. But if you behind me, he's very bright green. There's a lot of differences because he's in that part of the color space where it exists in RGB, but there's a much narrower range in CMYK, and some of those vibrant greens are not there. So in the printed book, it's much duller, which bugs me so much. But I know color theory, and I know that, maybe when the designer was working on this, maybe we should have chosen something a little bit more, CMYK friendly, that works better with that color space, but it's too late now.
Yeah. Well, my problem with Amazon hardcovers is they take 3 times as long to print as the paperbacks do. I mean, literally 3 times as long. You can print on demand paperbacks.
It takes over a month.
2 to 3 days. It's like 10 or more days for hardcover, and the quality control. So I ordered 5 of them just to see what they were like and to give away to people. I had no expectation that anybody would ever buy them. It turns out that a lot of my friends are paperback snobs. I don't know that anybody who is not a friend of mine bought the hardcovers, but I know there are a few of my friends actually bought the hardcovers because I went to the trouble to get the cover formatted for that so that I could have a hardcover. But their quality control is awful. It takes forever to get the book, and when you do, out of the 5 that I bought, 2 of them were trash. I mean, there's the covers were split, the pages were were riffled. And when you pick up a book in a store, you're not going to buy the one that has any damage on it. You're going to hand it to the person at the counter and say, there's something wrong with this book. So I'm like, I don't even feel comfortable giving them away. They sit on a table and I look at them and go, well, that was a waste of money. And out of 5, a 40% failure rate is just not acceptable.
Yeah. You're right. Mine arrived fine. It was just smudges and fingerprints on the book and a couple of scratches, but nothing that you wouldn't like notice unless you're in like bright light, and then it's very obvious.
The only plus side I've had is that of the people that I know bought hardcovers, I asked them specifically because of the problems I had, and none of them reported any problems with the copies they got. So maybe I just had a bum run, but it was very disappointing, and I'm like,
maybe because they ordered it they were one-offs. I don't know. I have no idea, because when I ordered mine, it was just one, and I didn't like the quality, so I never ordered any more.
Sure.
But I like the book vault ones. Not to put shade on it, because Amazon and KDP does a lot of really good things, and I've heard issues with that people have had with book vault and also Ingram. So it's very much like a case by case. It's
yeah, it seems like everybody has
luck of the draw.
Yeah, different experiences.
We're getting too much into the author thing. We got to stick on the reader. We're here to talk about books and stories and characters and magic and fantasy worlds, and escape all the author stuff.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, it's okay. It happens. It happens, and I know better than to let it go on, and but every once in a while, a peek behind the scenes, I think is a right.
I agree.
I think readers would be interested to know some of these little things. So we've got magic coming back. We've got FBI agents. We have our engineer Jeff. We have lots of characters in this book. So it sounds like from the structure, like we meet all of the protagonists and we get to know them, and then I guess then the magic starts to come back and we get all sorts of drama and trouble. And do they all, is there like a big like team up or like some big thing at the end, or are they all separately dealing with it? I'm just curious. Do all the threads come together or they stay separate? You could do it either way.
There's direct relationships between 3 of the POVs. You have the husband and wife, and the reporter is a close family friend of theirs. The FBI agent and the reporter end up teaming up basically to investigate something they have no idea it's related to magic. A 3-star review I got on Amazon, it made me laugh because I read it and I'm like, oh. They basically said this doesn't feel like a contemporary fantasy. It felt more like I was reading a Tom Clancy novel, and I'm like, really?
Oh, that's
I'm like, that's like the best 3-star review I could ever get, because I wrote this as like a thriller. I mean, you have people that don't understand what's going on, and you've got one POV that kind of knows what's going on, and then you've got mysterious POVs that you don't know what they're up to, and their stories over time start to merge and cross over one another, and till you ultimately you have a couple of conflicts towards the end of the book. There's a I won't call it an action sequence, but there is a point where things have hit the fan, but it's not the final confrontation. And then there's the final confrontation. And after the final confrontation is when a lot of well, here's what's really going on is explained. Mm-hmm. I saved my exposition to the end of the book because that's kind of the format of a thriller.
Yes.
They don't tell you what's going on until after, you have a resolution after the final confrontation. And that's the way this book is formatted. So if you like that type of story, the only thing that I will say is that it takes a while to develop these characters because there's multi-POVs. I really want you to care about them, so you'll keep reading. But it takes time to build them up so that
it's a slow.
It's definitely a slow burn.
Some thrillers are like, not all thrillers are like right out the gate high acting. Some of them are much slower because they have to develop. They have to figure out what the heck's going on.
I got a complaint that the book talks about the return of magic and that the magic didn't return until the very end of the book, and then I never did anything with it. And I'm like, well, yeah, I mean, it's the real world. if magic just suddenly appeared and I spent the entire book dealing with that, then what would be the point of this series?
So it's more like magical. I guess it's has something in common with magical realism in that way. It's like magical realism is like there's a magical item, but the story is not really about that. It's like the real world. It's sort of it's there and it's just sort of accepted. But they try to keep it sort of realistic. It's not like wild. It's like, somebody makes candy that makes people feel better. Like it's
so I will say this is a little spoilery because magic returning to our worlds happens very late in the book. There isn't a whole lot of time to play with that. There are magical creatures that are doing things at various portions in the book, but that's not the same as like magic flying around.
Right. That's book 2.
Yeah, that's book 2. My magic system is actually loosely modeled off of Tolkien, in that magic casting spells.
You invest your Feyya.
It's not really a thing. Magic is about artifice. It's about the act of creation. You imbue things with a purpose, and then you can use those things to do magical things. Magical creatures break that rule, obviously. They have inherent magical abilities, and they're in some ways very powerful, but they're also limited about what their intent, what they were created for. Magical creatures didn't just appear, they were created, and when they're created with a purpose, and their magic can only fulfill that purpose. Now that can be a pretty broad category of what they can do, but only a magic user, somebody who is trained in using magic, can actually has no limitation, but it is still an act of creation. It is not easy. You may never see a human wizard throw a fireball in my world, but you may see him with some pretty impressive magic items that he can do all kinds of fun things with. And there's one person that kind of breaks this rule too, because he's been doing it for a very long time. But yeah, my magic it's more soft magic. It's more, when I started thinking about this, I'm like, yeah, I really kind of like the way Tolkien does things, because there's kind of an inherent limit, just from it's more about the items, and then you have to explain the items more often than not. And I'll explain it more in the second book, because like I said, the first book is more or less just an inciting incident. It's about magic returning, and the whole book leads up to that event. And it's largely about these people who have no magic, have no idea that there is magic, having to deal with what happens when magical creatures start messing with them, and when they're being told about what's going to happen, because there's they're how do I do this without being spoilery?
Nobody escapes the episode of my podcast without giving away spoilers.
Yeah, they're being forced into a situation where magic will affect them, and there's nothing they can do about it except figure out how to deal. And these are just normal people. It's that was kind of the thing I kept driving home when I was writing this, is that if just as an example, if you throw a dragon at normal people and every day, they crap their pants and they run away.
Oh yeah. Dragons are terrifying in real life.
This isn't high fantasy. This isn't, there aren't some, wizened wizards going to go, you shall not pass to stop the demon from attacking. This is our present world. We have no knowledge of magic. We have technology, but is that necessarily any good? For your average person on the street, not military, but like just a guy, even a well-trained guy. I have an FBI agent in here, and even she's like, oh shit. So this is, purely about people who don't know anything about what's going on being thrust into something they cannot comprehend, and they're trying to be warned. And it's mostly about them deciding what to do about this, what they can do about it, what realistically they can do about it when they have no choices, no good choices. So yeah, I mean, I wrote a story that I thought I would enjoy, and I think I succeeded. I love the story, and I look forward to telling
reviews comparing you to Tom Clancy, I'd say you succeeded.
That was actually one of my worst reviews. They didn't they didn't like the fact that it started so slow, which is a common complaint. They loved the middle of the story, and they hated the fact that the magic returning didn't happen until almost the end of the book, and that I didn't really do anything with magic returning. They were really looking forward to the whole magic returns part and wanted to see what would happen with it. I'm like, that's not the point of this book. That's the
That
point
is
of people having to
interesting.
deal with the fact that magic is returning, not actually what happens when magic has returned. So, but they were the ones that said, yeah, I read more like a Tom Clancy novel. And I was really like, really?
That's awesome. So it's more like a magical thriller.
Yeah.
Or like a low magical thriller, because there's not big magic until the end. That's cool. Oh, thank you so much for coming on and talking about it.
Yeah, thanks
And
for having me.
you're also in the self-published fantasy blog off number 9, which is happening for now until
I
next
am
summer.
I am already booted from
Oh,
Spiffbo.
which cohort were
Yeah.
you in?
I was in Becky M's, and I was in her first 6 books, and I was the second book she
Oh.
revealed that she was not going to pass through. So I'm already out of that. But I am
Oh,
also
no.
in BBNYA, and I think the first round of that ends next week, I think. BBNYA is a lot quieter. They don't talk about their processes until each stage
Mhm.
happens. And they're very different from Spiffbo in that they request a 2,000 word excerpt from the beginning of your book and 10,000 word excerpt from the beginning of your book. And they have, I don't know, there's 200 and somewhere between 240 and 270 entrants.
Mhm.
And then they have a panel of unknown number of panelists. And the panelists actually go through and look at your title, your blurb,
Mhm.
they may look at your reviews, and they also look at your trigger warnings in case you've got some stuff in there they may not like. And they actually say, "I want to read these blurb. I want to read these excerpts." So they select the books they want to read, and they make sure that every book is, every excerpt is read by at least two people. And then those people, they're each assigned a certain number of excerpts that they have to read, and then they put forward ones that they want to go to the next round. And they only announce any movement on this when they start. When it gets to the second round, and they move from the 2K excerpts to the 10K excerpts, and then they start the whole process all over again. They put out the list of 10K excerpts, and the panelists all go, "I want to read this one. I want to read this one. I want to read this one," and they get assigned, multiple people to each excerpt. And I think it actually overlaps. They get more people to read the 10K excerpts, and then the final round is anybody who gets past that, they read the whole book and write reviews off of those whole books.
Oh, wow.
But the first phase for the 2K excerpts, I think they typically get like 30 of them or something that they have to deal with, but it's only 2,000 words each. And that, I think, is supposed to end like next Friday.
Well, I hope you get into the next round and all the way
Yeah,
to the end.
me too. Although I'm worried, my book starts really slow. Not a whole lot happens in the first 2,000 words, but I think
Oh, okay.
it's fairly well written and edited. So it certainly will get past some of the other indie pubs that are floating around. Quality's gotten a lot better, but there's still a few that people just don't edit very well or don't understand how important multiple layers of editing is.
Well, it's some people can't afford it either, and
Yeah,
it's a valid path to do the best that you can, and then as the books make money, upgrade them and
yeah,
do
absolutely.
more.
I didn't pay for a professional editor. I just forked out for Grammarly and went through it multiple times. And I didn't rely on Grammarly. Grammarly just pointed me in the direction, and I went, yeah, no, yeah, no, yeah, no. And I had already done my own round of editing just without any assistance, and I put it through a couple of different types of software before I finally got to Grammarly and realized how hardcore Grammarly is when it comes to all the different things it thinks may be wrong with your manuscript. Um, just to put it in perspective, I put it in Microsoft Word to see what Word thought about it, and Word said you have
Oh,
470
yeah.
things to correct. It's not great. I knew it wasn't
No,
great,
it's not.
but I went through and made decisions on every single one of those. And when I loaded it into Grammarly, after having made all the corrections that Word told me to, Grammarly said I had 4,500 things to address. I was like,
Well, it was 90,000 words
yeah,
to be fair to
yeah.
Grammarly,
Well, I
but we've
mean,
strayed from
yeah,
into
back to author
into
stuff.
Authorland, which we came here to have a break from and talk about books. So this has been great, and we wish you luck. And as you said, it was BBNY is what it's
Yeah,
called.
BBNY, the Book Bloggers Novel of the Year Award is what it stands
Gotcha.
for.
Well, we hope that you're in the running for that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me on, Melinda. This has
Oh,
actually been a lot of
you're
fun.
welcome. This was fun.
Maybe we'll have to get together and geek out about Tolkien because
Oh, yeah.
certainly one of my favorite fantasies. Are you a Wheel of Time nerd?
I read the first 8 books. I threw the 8th book against the wall and never went back. I hated books 5 through 8, and I never want to open another Wheel of Time book. The first 4 were great, and I
I have
yeah.
a slightly different. I have read all of them, some of them many times. So when my friends first recommended this to me, book 6 was the one that had just been released, so Lord of Chaos. And I read books 1 through 6, and I love them. Lord of Chaos, the 6th book, is actually one of my favorites. Book 7, when it finally came out, it had been like a year since I'd read the series. I'm like, I don't know, I'm going to go read the whole series again because I loved them so much. Read 1 through 6 again, read book 7 and went, that
I
felt
hated 7. It was
that
like,
felt kind of rushed. I mean, that was not. I mean, I love Jordan, but that was not a very satisfying book. But it was all right. 2 years later, book 8 comes out.
it felt very
I
slow.
I
Like
read.
there was just not
I,
much
I
going
went.
on.
Yeah, I went back and read 1 through 7 again, and I still went 7 is just not great. And then I read 8,
In
and I
book
went
8, like nothing happens.
8 was bad.
Literally
Where I'm
nothing
like,
happens.
yeah,
Like, I
nothing
kept
happens.
waiting for something to happen about 3/4 way through the book. I'm like, okay,
Oh, it gets
if
worse.
nothing have happened and we're 800 pages in, I'm not reading the rest
Yeah.
because I don't have any confidence that the couple hundred pages that are left, anything is going to happen. Like, there's
In
not been an
8,
inciting incident yet.
yeah, in 8, nothing really happens, but 9 was so much worse. It was
Yeah,
worse than
I didn't read
book
that
8.
one.
Book 10, I'm trying to think about that. Yeah, 10 was the worst in the entire series. I despised that book. And after I got done reading, I said, I'm never, because this is about the time that Jordan passed.
Yeah,
Was
and
the
then
release of book
Brandon
10.
took over.
And I had no idea who Brandon Sanderson was. He was at that time a pretty unknown author. I think he had only published Mistborn. I'm like, I don't know who this guy is.
Yeah, I didn't know who he
I
was either, so that
and
was
they
not a
and then
draw
they
for me.
announced, yeah, and then they announced so that Jordan had written one that was going to be published posthumously. That was book 11, and then they announced that Sanderson was going to finish the series with 12, 13, and 14. And I'm like, I've played this game where I've reread the entire series. I'm not buying any more of these books until every single book has been published. And I waited. I mean, like 8 years go by, and they finally released Memory of Light, the last book. And I'm like, okay. I went back and reread the entire series, but I knew the hills I was going to have to go through. So I read 1 through 6 because I loved all of them
Mhm.
and just slammed through them. And then I stopped and I took a break. And I went and
Yeah, I heard
read
that
some
you can
Dresden
skip
Files.
8 through 10 and you don't
Well,
miss anything.
the intent was to reread the whole series. So
Yeah.
I just took a break and I read some Dresden Files and I read some Honor
I've read
Harrington
many of
books.
those. Yes, I love those.
And then I came back and I'm like, I'm just going to jam through the ones that are awful. So I jammed through 8, 9, 10. Sorry, 7 through 10. And I went, those sucked just as much as I remember, but at
Yeah.
least now I'm through them. And I took another break and went back and read some more Dresden Files and I read some more Honor Harrington and then came back, and book 11, which was the last book that Jordan wrote, was amazing. He went out with a bang, which is too bad. It was so much better than anything he had written since the early books. And then Sanderson did a really good job of finishing it off.
That's what
12,
I've heard.
13, and 14 were all good. Memory of Light was amazing. The last book, I'm like, okay, it was worth it. But I'm glad I waited until the whole series is out so I could just, one of these days, I'm going to get around to rereading 11 through 14 again, because those are the only books that I've only read once. And it was a very good experience. But yeah, I don't think I'll ever be able to bring myself to read the whole series all over again. I just don't have as much time to read as I used to. I'm like a book a month guy, where at one time I was like a book a week guy or 2 books a week.
Yeah, and it's just too painful to have to go through 7 through 10 again.
Yeah,
There's life
no
is too
interest.
short to read
Yeah,
bad books.
well, and
So
there's so many good books coming out. I mean, when I started writing, the Garden Gnome, I had not actually been doing that much reading. My reading has been very cyclic. There will be times where I'm just like reading all the time, every time I have free time, and then there are times I'm like, I don't read for a year, 2 years, anything. And I'm like, I really need to get back into reading more, because I have a tendency to read older stuff because I'm an old guy. And I wasn't really keeping track of what the modern fantasy was. I actually tried to read A Way of Kings to get back into reading again, which is Sanderson's first of his big epic series.
yeah, I haven't read it yet.
I read the first 2 chapters and I'm like, I can't do this. I'm like, I have no idea what's going on, but I'm definitely not ready for something like this to kick off my reading again. But I'm like, I need to read more to see what modern fantasy feels like these days, because I've been reading old crap for so long, or stuff that's even just like 10 or 15 years, not even classic stuff, just stuff that was published 10 or 15 years ago. I haven't read anything new. So I read the Greenbone saga last fall because I wanted to kind of immerse myself in more modern stories, and I was blown away. I mean, the
I don't
Greenbone
think I've
saga
read that.
So it's by Fonda Lee, and it is contemporary fantasy.
Is
That's
that the
actually one of
Jade City?
yeah, Jade
Yeah,
City, Jade
I've
Ward,
seen
and
it.
Jade
Yeah,
Legacy.
I haven't read it yet.
You know, Jade City, the first one, is really good. It's not what you expect it to be. It was not what I expected it to be. Jade War was good. It felt like more of the same, which was okay. I mean, it was good. It was not as good as Jade City. Jade Legacy was brave. It was amazing. At first, I was a little put off by it because it has a very different methodology of story arc, but it ended up being my favorite of the books because, I mean, long and the short of it is Fonda Lee could have milked this series for years. Instead, she did a multi-generational epic to end a 3-book series.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, the first book takes place over the course of a few months. The second book takes place over the course of maybe 5 years, but with the same characters from the first book.
Mm-hmm.
The third book takes place over like 3 decades. And it basically is like all these characters that you've come to know and love. I'm going to tell you their story, how things, I'm going to tell you what their happy or unhappy ending is. And it was amazing. It blew me away. I never would have expected somebody to do that at the end of a trilogy, and because it was so satisfying. She could have just wrapped it up as like, and here's the end of the conflict of this 3-story arc. No, instead she said the end of that 3-story arc is actually the encapsulation of an entire generation of this family, and
That's pretty cool.
yeah, it was amazing. So yeah,
well, it's on the wish list. I'll eventually get to it. The wish list is also 14 pages long, but we won't talk about that.
Yeah, I don't let myself get too long of a TBR because I get very, like I said, very cyclic in my reading, and sometimes I don't read for weeks, and then I'll sit down and read an entire book in an evening, and I never know when I'm going to get to something. And as it is, I've already got too many physical books that I need to read.
See, all mine are digital, so my TBR can be as long as I want it to be because it's just on my phone.
Yeah, I've got some digital ones too. I finally broke down and bought a Kindle Paperwhite to be easy on my eyes, but I also have books on my phone. And my wife has an Audible account that we listen to when we're in the car. So I have at any one time about 4 books going on at the same time. I usually have one physical, one on my phone, one on my Kindle, and an audiobook that we're in the middle of. So
I do a lot of audiobooks. I like them.
I like them.
Jam.
Yeah, I like them when I'm driving. But any other time, like if I'm working, I know a lot of people that can, do their work and listen to an audiobook at the same time. And I always feel like
one of them.
I always feel like I miss so much of it because my focus suddenly, like I have to hyper focus on something for work, and then I lose like half a chapter.
That's when you pause it. If you have to hyper focus. Yeah, as a long time audiobook listener and office worker, if I'm just QCing a website and like clicking around, if it's something that doesn't need the mind, audiobook is on. If I'm, updating the project plan for one of the projects that I'm running, writing like emails, updates, or like just updating anything to do with like project stuff, like I'm a project manager for IT. The audiobook is not on. It is paused because all of that takes a lot of concentration.
Yeah.
Especially like updating the project plans and all the documentation that goes along with that. Because you have to be you have to there's just so much that like you have to think about that goes into that, like as you're tracking the project status. So yeah, I don't have the audiobook on for that.
Sure. All right, Melinda.
This has been fantastic.
It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. So I am Melinda Kucsera, your indie fantasy author, and this is Jeff McIntyre, and we've been talking about the Garden Gnome and about 70,000 other things. So
yeah,
thank you,
Jeff.
Have
a few tangents.
There's always tangents. We've gone off on all kinds of tangents on here, and we will continue to go off on all kinds of tangents in the future because it's fun. And I never know where exactly an episode is going to end up. But I think we've we've landed at a good place, and we'll leave you guys to go and check out the Garden Gnome. It's on Amazon, Goodreads, and other places. And I've got links in the show notes and in the description, depending on where you're viewing or listening to this. And this has been fantastic. And, maybe Jeff will come back in the future to talk about book 2, or maybe we'll have a Lord of the Rings episode. I've been thinking about doing that, actually. I know quite a few lore masters who teach classes. So I was thinking about maybe getting some of them together, if we can get the schedules to match. It is definitely on my mind. I'm like an enormous Lord of the Rings nerd, and I know people who are even bigger nerds. So and also want to do a haven't quite figured out how to do this yet, but the idea came up in the Spiffbo group. I think I asked because another author mentioned it, to do a like a Dungeons and Dragons or some kind of role-playing things with authors. Some of the authors who are interested and part of the self-published fantasy blog offer this year, and have our characters, somehow we play our characters and see what happens, and have an actual like maybe a tournament thing, or and maybe it's an adventure thing. I don't know exactly. I haven't found anybody to DM it yet, or GM it, or I'm not sure the terminology there. I've also never played Dungeons and Dragons, so it is still something that is very much on my mind. I know another author mentioned it when we did the interview. I did float it in the group. There was definite interest. I've just been very busy. My cousin's getting married in a couple of weeks, and my dad is going on home dialysis, so there's a lot with that. But as soon as and there's lots of wonderful interviews, so once things start to quiet down, maybe in the fall or the winter, because the Spiffbo thing is ongoing until next, I think May it finishes, May of 2024. So there's still plenty of time that we could do some kind of fantasy, because we are fantasy authors. I feel like we need to do some kind of character something, because that could be a lot of fun. So stay tuned for that.
I've done a decent amount of role playing in my lifetime.
Yeah, so maybe you'll want to be part of it. Yeah, so I did put the initial post up. It is something that I think it'd be kind of fun that we have some kind of actual, I don't know if it's session. I don't know if it's RPG, or we do like Mortal Kombat style, tournaments, and we role play our characters. I with dice, that could be kind of fun, and we have some kind of overarching, yes, your characters in your own worlds have whatever, but here in this, wherever we're having this realm, these are the limitations that everybody has, because there's a couple people who are like, oh, my character has infinite powers, and well, that won't be allowed, because that wouldn't be a
lot of fun for everybody else.
Exactly, but that is something that I'm definitely very interested in doing. It's just a time thing, and I will get that straightened out as things go forward. So yeah, keep your calendars open, because I definitely want to do it on the podcast, and maybe it'll be more than one episode. I have no idea. I think it just could be really fun if we had some kind of, I like the combat idea. I think that could be pretty fun, but with dice or something, so it's random.
Sounds good.
So, thank you so much. And
thank you.
Yeah, everybody have a great day or great night from wherever you're listening, and we will see you in the next episode.
Goodbye.
Oh. I love that. On that note, see you next time.
Bye.